Well, good afternoon, Betsy. How are you?
Great, and great to see you today, Richard.
Likewise, so amazing to see you as well. We are speaking to Betsy Biemann. Betsy is the CEO of CEI. That's kind of fun, right? CEO
Right.
of CEI. And we're so excited to have you join us today. Um, of course, we want to learn everything we can about the amazing work that you folks are doing at CEI. But before we do that, before we sort of explore your work at CEI and all the great stuff you're doing there, we'd love to hear a little bit about you, Betsy. Can you introduce yourself and maybe kind of talk to us a little bit about your background and your career in education? That would be awesome.
Sure. Well, I guess one of the first things is that I'm the daughter and granddaughter of immigrants to this country.
That's amazing.
Um, my ancestors came here sort of to build a better life,
Right.
and they were able to do that. And I think that sort of grounds me with a feeling, it's a passion for the fact
Mm.
that I believe that everyone in this country should have an opportunity to sort of put down roots, uh, secure a decent livelihood, and be part of the community. So I think that's
Outstanding.
a lot of what's made our country great,
Mhm.
and it's something that I'm excited to be able to support through our work. I didn't start off thinking that I would become the head of a community development financial institution.
Does anybody?
I grew up in a family of scientists, and I thought I was going to be a scientist as well. But then I spent a couple summers doing research, and I realized, I find science and technology really interesting, but I don't want to be a scientist.
Yeah, not for me, not my career.
Not for
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
So if you had told me at the time I'd end up in my role, I would have been quite surprised. But
Right.
I think there were some experiences along the way as a young person that sort of informed who I became. I
Hmm.
had a wonderful um, role model of a woman entrepreneur in my aunt, who
Hmm.
I grew up in the Boston area. She owned a diner in downtown Boston. And, when I was 10 or 11, I'd go in on Saturdays and I'd get to work the register at lunchtime when it was busy. And I loved the bustle of the place.
Yeah.
And she was a great role model of a woman business owner, which was frankly unusual for her
Sure.
generation.
Sure.
She was financially independent. She was an employer of a very small but very diverse workforce who worked in the restaurant. And so I got to sort of see all of that. I think
Nobody
another,
hustles like a restaurant entrepreneur,
oh
right?
my
I mean,
goodness.
yeah. Yeah.
She was there at like 4:30 every morning.
Right.
Because that's
And
when
probably 7 days a
deliveries.
week. And yep. Yep.
And
Yep.
so she worked very hard. And it was just, as I said, a wonderful role model for a young woman.
I can imagine. Yeah. That's amazing.
Another important experience or sort of formative experience was I was in college in the early to mid 80s during the anti-apartheid movement.
Sure. Yeah.
And really that I think exposed me to the fact that capital aligned with values can
Mhm.
expand economic and frankly political opportunity
Sure.
in that case. And that left a mark on me as well.
Hmm.
Finally, when I finished college, I actually spent a year teaching in a rural girls' secondary school in Western Kenya.
Oh,
And
wow.
that was, as you can imagine, an amazing experience for me, but really,
Yes.
I think saw the power of not only education and small business, because I lived with a family who were entrepreneurs themselves. They ran
Right.
several businesses, but also sort of learned about the really persuasive data that
Mhm.
not education is really important for everyone, but
Mm.
when you invest in girls and women, there is a multiplication of that impact, both for the life of that young person, for their future family,
Sure.
and
For their community, especially. Yeah. Completely
so
agree.
those were a lot of early but important experiences that sort of helped me along my way.
Yeah, paved the way. Very pivotal moments. I had no idea that you had
Yeah.
worked as a rural educator in Kenya. That's fascinating. Yeah, absolutely fascinating. And I can see how this could, pave the path to, like you said, to community development and as a community finance leader. So, we know that CEI is pretty unique in its mission and what it does specifically for communities in rural Maine and beyond. But can you just tell us a little bit about CEI and then also a little bit about, the very important mission that you guys have towards supporting equity within the economy and resilience within the communities that you're a part of?
Sure.
Yeah.
So our mission is to grow a more just, vibrant, and climate resilient future for people and communities in Maine and in rural regions around the country. And we do it by integrating our financing of small businesses and community facilities, our business advice and coaching, as well as our policy advocacy.
Sure.
Because we could give a new small business loan every week, and at the end of the year, the economy would still work fundamentally the same way.
Right.
So what we do is we take what we're learning by working with entrepreneurs and small business owners across Maine, understanding the challenges they face, what kinds of special kinds of financing they need, or what kind of business advice they need that sort of helps them get over barriers they may have encountered. And then we bring that knowledge and that data and those stories to policy networks and conversations, both at the state level in Maine and also at the federal level. And we've done this for 47 years.
It's amazing.
My predecessor, Ron Phillips, founded the organization, and he grew up in actually a fishing community in Massachusetts.
Oh, okay.
Married a woman, Suzanne, who grew up in Waldoboro, Maine, where they've lived ever since. And he came here and he recognized that that it was no longer as easy
Sure.
for someone to graduate from high school, walk across the street to the paper mill, or walk down the dock to become a lobsterman, or go work in a textile manufacturing facility and earn a decent living where you can buy a house, raise your family, secure a decent livelihood. And so he really saw that sort of automation and later globalization was making those jobs really go away from many rural communities. But that on the flip side, Maine had these extraordinary natural resources, the Gulf of Maine and all the fish and the sea vegetables, the forests, the farmland, and that if you had, some maybe business advice or coaching, some access to capital, you could start a small business that could, potentially support you and support your family, and allow you to have and even to create jobs for other people.
Sure. And start to create that concept of generational wealth too, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was absolutely. Okay, please go. Yeah.
Yeah, no. And so he really started the organization, just in mid-coast Maine. It's why we're called Coastal Enterprises, because we first started working primarily with coastal businesses.
Sure.
Over time, grew to be working statewide across Maine, and then starting around 30 years ago, started creating several financing subsidiaries that actually work regionally and nationally. So we've continued, though, all along to focus on that financing, business advice, and policy advocacy, and focusing on entrepreneurs who are often underestimated by the traditional financial system, or frankly shut out of the traditional financial system because they're in a very rural community, they're a woman entrepreneur, they're a first-time entrepreneur, they're a person of color or an immigrant or a refugee who's new to the country, or they're just, they're working in a tough, high-risk industry, and maybe your traditional banker doesn't know a lot about food systems and sees a food business, a first-time entrepreneur who wants to start a food business, says, that's a little too risky for us.
Right.
We're going to turn down your loan. And they'll say, no. And whereas if they walk in our door, even if we say no, i.e., if their loan application, let's say they would say, I want to borrow $75,000 for 3 years, but when we look at the business plan, it's not going to generate enough revenues to cover the interest and principal payments for that. We'll say, instead of just no, we'll say, gee, why don't you work with one of our business advisors?
Right.
And figure out whether maybe you could borrow 50,000 instead of 75,000, which it looks like you can afford. Or gee, you have sort of some credit issues, or your credit score is very low, or your collateral, it looks like two people own it, not just you. If you could work that out, come back in 6 months and let's talk again. So we're always trying to find out how to make something work rather than sort of a yes or a no, sorry.
I appreciate that. And one of the things that was on my mind as you were talking, Betsy, we those of us that don't live in Maine, right, or maybe have some sort of tertiary familiarity with Maine, think about, oh, Maine, it's to your point, it's tourism, it's fishing, it's timber, paper, textiles, farming. And look, climate change is affecting those. There's a lot of shifting going on in these local industries. You are really working to understand and make sure how these vital resources continue and remain in the communities that they serve. I know myself on the investment side, we're always talking about, well, we have to de-risk this investment, de-risk, right? And I really appreciate how, as a community development financial institution, your model is different, right, than those traditional financial institutions. You're really thinking about how to effectively make social impact. I also didn't realize that part of what you do in helping to de-risk is to provide business advisory services to potential entrepreneurs as well. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on some of those services, Betsy?
So we traditionally did mostly one-on-one business advising, as we call it. So that really helps because often, frankly, a small business owner doesn't necessarily want to reveal all of their sort of sensitive or personal financial information in a group.
Right.
Or they're concerned about a competitor learning about what they're doing. So we have for many years done one-on-one business advising.
Amazing.
What we have learned over time, particularly we have a number of we have several programs that work with women entrepreneurs. And we started to hear that, I think we all know that entrepreneurship is a very isolating activities.
Sure. It can be very lonely. Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
Lonely. You're isolated. You don't have like peer support like you do if you work in an office and there are folks.
Right. Maybe your family doesn't quite understand what you're doing. You maybe don't have their support. Yeah.
Yeah. And so our Women's Business Center programming started to create some cohort-based programs. So we have one for women who have a tech-based business idea, because women may either feel less confident or may have fewer technology skills, or appreciate that the opportunity to network with other women who also are starting a tech-based business and sort of have that peer support. And we also connect folks with a mentor who's an experienced tech entrepreneur. So we have found that there's some specific needs or opportunities for training and supporting entrepreneurs where a cohort-based approach
makes
outstanding sense. So we have a number of those. We have a wonderful one that's also cohort-based it's our childcare business lab, where similarly, just like we'll finance let's say we'll work with a baker who is a really talented baker, but doesn't necessarily know how to run a bakery business. There are folks in our state where childcare is a huge need, who have perhaps an early childhood education credential. They've worked in the local primary school, but they don't necessarily know how to run and operate a childcare program either in home or in a facility. And so we bring together folks who want to start a childcare program for a series of months, and they develop their vision and their plan. We help them get certified. If they're going to be in a facility, we help them find a facility, because the state has very specific regulations about egress and parking and everything, your educational credentials, et cetera. And so we basically help set them up for success and sort of high quality provision of high quality childcare through this childcare business lab. We started that right before the pandemic, and boy, was it really timely, because of course, then I think mean, we knew this, but I think there's a much greater appreciation now that childcare is really needs to be part of the business or small business ecosystem.
Absolutely.
We
Yeah.
we had Cynthia Murphy, who really developed and leads that work. She was interviewing a small business owner in northern Maine, and at the beginning of all this, and he said, "Yes, this is a huge need for us. We had our local childcare program closed on a Friday, and the following Monday, 4 of our employees quit."
Wow.
So it's a very sort of direct connection,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
especially in rural communities, the provision of childcare. So that's another example of this kind of cohort-based business advising we do.
I appreciate that a lot. And it's so, consequential too, what you said about like, people thinking that childcare services are not part of small business, right? Small business owners have the same family support needs that individuals who work for large established companies that might have bigger benefit packages or those kinds of things. I know that at its core, and you've just given some great examples with your cohorts. I know at its core, though, CEI is still really focused on, renewable energy and agriculture and fisheries. How do you kind of divide, I guess, Betsy, because I know your resources are limited, your financing is limited. How do you kind of divide between the different sorts of like sectors or specific initiatives that CEI wants to focus on and kind of, I don't know if this is the right term, Betsy, but be able to kind of like smooth out or spread out your impact as much as you possibly can?
Well, we've had a commitment to the sort of natural resources based industries since our founding.
Sure.
And what we feel is important is that we not only have our sort of traditional lenders and I want to say generic business advisors, but we have also some people on our team who have specific knowledge about those sectors.
Right.
So we can't just sort of willy-nilly decide, oh, let's do food this week and let's do aquaculture next
week. Yeah.
We sort of have what we have found is that having consistent long-term focus on several high impact sectors is really important because not only do we build that expertise,
right,
but also we learn. Right. We not only learn the husbandry, we have 2 folks who focus on fisheries and aquaculture, and Hugh Copperthwaite, who leads that work, has worked with us for over 20 years. And he knows a lot about how do you grow kelp, mussels, scallops, oysters, and has a lot of connections in the industry, not only in Maine, but we actually in that industry, and it's really interesting. In other parts of the world, there are more mature shellfish aquaculture industries. So we've actually brought folks from Maine to Japan to learn how they farm different shellfish and kelp. And we've brought folks from Japan who have developed specialized equipment here to demonstrate that equipment. We've purchased some of that equipment and shared it with a number of different folks so they can sort of test it out and sort of try before you buy.
Wow.
And so we, you can't sort of just do that in a week. You learn that over time. You develop those relationships in the industry, the trust. Folks if you're an entrepreneur, especially if you're a farmer or you're working in fisheries and aquaculture, you're already sort of at the mercy of Mother Nature and the changing climate. Yep. And so you don't really like to take risks lightly.
Sure.
You want to see, someone else has done this before, and I can go talk to them, learn from them, and we can often connect those folks. We have this wonderful program called Aquaculture in Shared Waters, where we partner with a few other organizations in Maine. And over the last, I think it's now 8 or 10 years, about 450 people have taken that course. It's really learning about aquaculture. You could be someone new who wants to start an aquaculture company, or you could be someone, maybe you've been a lobsterman for a long time and you're interested in diversifying your revenue streams and you'd like to start farming kelp. So you can go and you can learn from other folks in Maine who've been farming kelp before you, and you can get connected with the folks at Cooperative Extension and at the University of Maine who can help you if you have, really technical questions. So we are doing a lot. Again, we sort of take the long view of these, that fisheries, farming, and food, and more recently, clean energy. These are sort of fundamentally important sectors where the scale of the capital need fits ours.
Yeah.
We do a little work in forestry, but because a lot of forest products, obviously paper companies are very large and their capital needs are very large.
Yeah.
We have done a little bit. We've actually mentioned we've created some financing subsidiaries.
Mm-hmm.
We have a financing subsidiary that uses something called the New Markets Tax Credit as a way to finance rural manufacturing. Is our focus there, and through that entity, we have financed a tissue paper company in very, very far northern Maine about 10 years ago, and it basically took what was a pulp company that probably would not have been able to survive by purchasing two very large tissue machines, which are gigantic, and require certain level of training and knowledge to operate.
The worker, yeah.
We helped them to purchase that, start that new complementary company, and then we helped them to create some partnerships because it's very rural, very northern Maine. You're not going to get people to move easily from, say, Portland or other places to Baileyville. So what they were really going to need is to pull, hire 65 people from the surrounding communities who are going to need some training. So we helped them. We partnered with the community college and another training partner, put together some training modules so that folks could get that baseline skill level that they needed, and then built on that additional training modules. So every new module that they completed, they got, I think it was an extra 50 cents per hour bump in their hourly wage. So again, we sort of think holistically about more holistically than, say, a private equity partner would have in that case.
Right.
Seeing the whole system, it's not only manufacturing tissue in these gigantic roles.
Right. It's not about the tissue.
It's like, well, how is the workforce going to work, and how will it environmentally work?
How are we going to train them? Yes, absolutely.
And it was
amazing.
I had not been there before because that original investment took place before I started in my role here 8 years ago. But I went up and visited and got a tour of the plant in June and talked to the woman who today oversees their workforce training for the whole 65 new, no longer new, but the tissue employees.
Wow.
And about of the original 40 or so who went through that training, 25 of them are still there. And they were, she talked to the, I think he was the plant manager. She said, I think everyone who is still working here, who got that initial training 8 or 10 years ago, now owns their home.
Wow. Oh my God. What an impactful thing. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And again, talk about creating generational wealth. You're, or removing retirement inequities. Home ownership is a huge hurdle towards that.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah, absolutely.
And this was the 65 people working for the second company. Again, there were about 300 people working for the pulp company manufacturer that is still operating,
right? Because it's a raw material provider.
Exactly.
That's great. So it is really an ecosystem. It's all interconnected,
right?
Yeah.
Yes. But at CEI, that the sort of parent nonprofit that I mostly am talking about today, we typically make loans, from as small as sort of $10,000 or $15,000 to largest, around $2 million. Obviously, many more of the little ones than those bigger ones.
Absolutely,
but that's basically the range that we finance out of our small business loan portfolio. We have, that small bit. We make, I think last year we made $22 million worth of small business loans, about 130 loans. But as a whole, our loan portfolio is currently a little over 70 million, and
Wow,
it's
that's so impressive.
over 400 small businesses.
That's so impressive. Betsy, I was personally involved in the late 90s with developing a group purchasing power opportunity for Massachusetts fishermen. We worked in conjunction with the Massachusetts Fishermen's Partnership, and what we were creating for them was like a GPO opportunity for them to buy low-cost health insurance because, as you know, fishermen and fisherwomen are extremely high risk. So sometimes insurers don't want to touch them, but then also, buying health insurance as an individual versus having the opportunity to have group purchasing power is a big difference, right? In terms of a risk pool and cost sharing. We had to make some tough decisions during that process, Betsy, around who qualified, who didn't qualify, and we tried to balance, the financial stability of what we had available to us in the Massachusetts Fishing Partnership, right? And in the federal government loans that we had. But clearly there was a lot of social impact that we knew we might be leaving on the table, depending upon the types of decisions that we made, everything from eligibility criteria to who we selected as our reinsurer to what we set premiums and deductibles at, right? It was a very complex scenario. I still think about those decisions and how they really impacted people's lives, right? As you kind of work through your role as the leader of CEI, and you got some big decisions that come in front of you, Betsy. Do you have a certain approach to how you work through those?
Well, I mentioned one of them a little here, and that is sort of that when there's a high impact opportunity, we're always trying to find a way to solve the problem, not to just say no. I mean, obviously, we have to turn down a lot of loan applications every year.
You just have to. Yeah.
If they don't, and part of that is because we get our capital. We don't have an endowment like a foundation or something. We get our capital from a number of different sources. We borrow money from banks. Of course, they need that back.
But you have to service that debt that you've borrowed.
Plus interest. We sometimes we're able to get a loan, what's sort of an impact investment, as it's called, or a loan from a foundation that's interested in the work that you do. So, for example, because of our work in childcare, we have not only some grant support from a foundation called the Lumina Foundation, but they also made a 10-year, $1 million, 1% loan to us for our childcare lending.
Wow. That's pretty favorable terms. That's amazing.
And then what that enables us to do then is to finance our childcare loans between 2.75% and 3.25% interest. It also enables us to sort of create bespoke or sort of specialty designed loans for that sector. Because when we work with childcare programs, we ask them to commit to have a certain number of their slots in their childcare for kids who come from low-income families, therefore qualify for a subsidy from the state. So the money that comes from the state doesn't come immediately. There's a lag time. So when we, so we have our, so we craft our loans and the requirements for principal and interest payments to match the sort of financial realities of running one of these childcare. So that is why we love working with foundations
like that. Yeah, absolutely.
It helps us to meet the needs of the folks we're trying to work with and help them to succeed, not by putting more barriers in front of them, but by being well aligned and understanding their needs.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot.
Two other resources. Sometimes we're able to get grants for lending, which is always great, either from the federal government.
Yeah, because you don't have to pay that money back. Yeah, that's great.
So that then can be sort of almost like a revolving loan where we'll make a loan, it gets paid back, and we're able to then make another loan. And finally, we have something called CEI investment notes, where if you're an accredited investor, either a foundation or a wealthy individual, you can actually invest in CEI, almost like a promise.
Almost like a limited partner type approach.
Yeah. And it's where we say between 3 and 10 years, we will invest your money in Maine small businesses, mostly Maine small businesses, and this is the interest rate that you will get. But with all of those, except for the grants, we have to pay these folks back. So we have to have
with interest,
with interest. And so we have to sort of strict lending policies that
makes sense.
Recognize that we are not a traditional financial institution, but that we have this mission. So we have a mission matrix where we can dial the interest rate a little bit lower if it's a very high, very high impact small business loan. But we can't fund everyone. So it does mean that there are times when there are great projects and we can't finance them, or we need other partners. So we worked with, there was a 12-acre parcel on the working waterfront in Yarmouth, Maine, that had been used a lot as sort of working waterfront property that benefited a number of marine and fisheries related small businesses in that community and nearby communities. And the family who owned it needed to sell it. And it could have gotten sold for, condos and little docks and things like that. But it was an important part of the infrastructure of that industry in that community. And so a nonprofit organization called the Seaman Foundation was created, and we worked with them and a local place-based foundation called the Sewell Foundation.
Okay.
So they made a grant, and we were able to make a loan that tapped some federal money, and working together with this nonprofit, we were able to finance the acquisition. And it's now managed as sort of a business incubator and sort of working waterfront infrastructure. And there are, a dozen or two small businesses that use or benefit from that infrastructure. So if that's sort of the example where if they had come to us originally and said, we need a loan to cover this, we had just said no, it's not going to work. The financing won't work. But again, by bringing together the right partners, you can sometimes, not always, you could sometimes find a way to get a project over the finish line that has that real multiplication of impact that a project like that will have.
And that to me is just so integral and amazing to what you folks do at CEI. Like as a non-traditional lending institution, if I walked into a bank and the bank denied me a loan, that's kind of the end of it, right? And you guys don't allow for the end of it. I really appreciate that. Betsy, you talked a little bit about your journey. And, this is a podcast that is dedicated to women in leadership positions like yourself and women entrepreneurs, especially with the commitment on social entrepreneurship. If a young woman today was kind of looking to do the kind of work that you're doing, create social impact within her community, particularly like you're doing in rural areas or traditional underserved populations, what would you say to her? What advice might you offer as she kind of begins that journey?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Well, I was really fortunate at the beginning of my career. I just finished graduate school, and I was fortunate to get a 1-year fellowship at the Rockefeller Foundation.
Wow.
This is when I was still working internationally.
Right.
And I was able to do a project with them that year about smallholder agriculture as a way for folks in African countries to secure a decent livelihood for them, for themselves and their families, and sort of what could countries do maybe through public policy to support that. But one incredible thing about working at the Rockefeller Foundation, to which I later returned and worked for 9 years before I went to Maine, was to have an opportunity to learn about social enterprises and get to know incredibly innovative and impactful organizations around the country. That is, in fact, when I first learned about coastal enterprises and, in fact, met Ron Phillips.
Oh, wow.
Living in New York City and working then nationally, and getting to know these organizations. But in addition to CDFIs, which I supported some of and invested in some of as then a grant maker and an impact investor at Rockefeller, I also got to know a lot of other social enterprises, whether they were, say, organizations helping people who were coming out of prison or were in recovery to get a job and sort of reestablish themselves, find access to housing they could afford, and continue to build a better life for themselves.
Nice.
There were, so I'd say one thing to do is to find your way either to an organization like CEI, so a CDFI, or and work there and learn,
get that experience,
or to work in an organization that partners with or finances with CDFIs or other social enterprises.
That makes sense.
If people are interested in CDFIs in particular, there is something called if you Google CDFI locator, there are 1,400 CDFIs around the country. Some of them focus, like we do, particularly on small business or community facilities finance. Some of them focus on affordable housing finance. Some of them do both. There are also credit unions that are CDFIs, and there are actually CDFI banks.
Outstanding.
But you can, as I said, there are 1,400 of them. If you're in the state of Connecticut or Texas,
or wherever you are,
go on and you can learn about what are the different CDFIs that are working in my region. You can then look and see, do they have internships?
Right.
We have a summer internship program.
Oh, fabulous.
We have a justice fellowship. We bring 3 folks per year to work with us for a whole year as a paid employee with benefits, to work on a project that advances equity. And these are typically folks who not only bring their early work experience, but also community connections and lived experience to their time with us.
Wow, that is outstanding.
So there are opportunities out there.
Yeah.
There are starting to be at business schools courses like Reimagining Capitalism and things where you'll often see case studies of CDFI. So when I have a master's in public policy. But even, I had friends who went to business school, and when I was in graduate school, there wasn't much knowledge about, folks in business schools didn't really embrace or really see what organizations like CEI were doing at the time as quote unquote business. I think they've really learned that we do business, and also that frankly, students today are really interested in aligning their work.
Oh yeah, they absolutely are. Yes.
And so there's actually a demand by students for learning about these kinds of organizations.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, that's great advice. Yeah, that's great advice. Betsy, thank you. As I mentioned earlier, we have been talking with Betsy Biemann, the CEO of Coastal Enterprises Incorporated, or CEI. Thank you for the work that you and your team are continuing to do to foster innovation in these under-resourced communities, especially as we have climate change and new technology and a global workforce now. Also, really thank you for those tips and tricks for anybody who may be interested in kind of a career in social impact. Hopefully they'll take your advice and follow that down. And again, thank you for your time today, telling us your story and the story of CEI. And if folks want to find CEI, can you please give the website?
Or it's CEIMaine.org. And that's McKinney at the end, like this.
Yes, the state of Maine. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Well, once again, Betsy Biemann, thank you for your time. It was lovely to spend some time chatting with you and learning more about you and CEI.
Sure. Thanks for sharing.